Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our Protected Areas webinar today. My name is Coral Wysocki and I'm the Program Coordinator at Carolinian Canada. We will be having a question and answer period at the end of the presentations. If you have a question throughout the presentation, please write that in the chat box and I will read the questions out at the end. We'd like to give a special thank you to our Protected Areas Task Force and Indigenous partners for their contributions to the development of this strategy for the Carolinian Zone. We'd also like to acknowledge that we are facilitating this webinar with the intention of creating an ethical space for cross-cultural exchange of knowledge and collaboration. We ask that all participants communicate and listen while keeping in mind the values of peace, respect, and friendship. We'll have 3 presenters today, and the presentations will run about 45 minutes. And starting us off is Michelle Cantor. She is the Executive Director of Carolinian Canada, and she is going to speak first about the connections of the Protected Areas Strategy to the Big Picture Collaborative.
Thank you, Coral. The Big Picture Collaborative is a coalition of groups that is interested in protecting the Carolinian Zone, the unique nature of the Carolinian Zone. And the Protected Areas Strategy is one piece of this. So despite all our best efforts, we are still losing habitat in the Carolinian Zone. The Big Picture is Canada's largest ecosystem recovery program in terms of species, habitats, and people. Without it, our landscape would surely be in worse shape. So we convened 150 partners across the zone last year to address the urgent situation. As you can see, this summarizes the amount of habitat we have in the zone. And many of you may be familiar with the federal guidelines that say we need 30 to 50% habitat in order to have resilient landscapes, to protect our air, water, and soil, be resilient in the face of extreme weather, and also, obviously, to protect our wildlife. So in the Carolinian Zone, the state we're in is that we have 15% habitat, which is half of what we need. Much of that is degraded and fragmented. And we also have a gap of 15% that we need to restore in order to reach the minimum 30%. When we overlay the Protected Areas Strategy on this landscape, we're looking at the fact that we are starting with 2.5% protected area and a global goal of 17% protection on landscapes around the world, with representation from all ecosystem types. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. So the Big Picture Collaborative came together. As I said, we convened 150 partners. It is a collective impact approach. We can do more together by connecting efforts, linking diverse sectors, using new technology, and capitalizing on demand for green investment. And most importantly, setting clear goals, clear shared goals. If we want to scale up healthy habitat action, we need to explore new ways of collaborating, new ways of doing and funding conservation. Our model of collaboration bundles healthy habitat projects on a fragmented landscape for greater impact. And just to be clear, the coalition is more of a convener of different partners. We are a connector, an enabler, a linker, and a tracker. But we don't actually do a lot on the landscape ourselves. And we coordinate a joint conservation strategy between all these groups. Sorry, just getting used to the technology here. So our Big Picture Collaborative has identified 3 principles for ecosystem recovery and 8 linked objectives that build on current programs. So we have over 100 groups in our network and they have really good programs. So what these goals do is identify what are the good programs that are going on, identify how we could scale them up and track them collectively so that we actually know if we're progressing from year to year. So that's what the Big Picture Collaborative does. And as you can see, from objective number 3, the protected area strategy is directly linked to protecting biodiversity in the Carolinian Zone. And protected areas can act as an anchor to a good natural heritage strategy. So our goal is that we can color the zone green again, and identify and expand the protected areas that have a vital role to play to anchor a strong natural heritage system, model best practices, and share seeds of plants and ideas in their greater ecosystem. So I invite you all to join the Big Picture Collaborative, and that's it for the introduction to the big picture, and I'll pass it back to Coral now.
Thanks, Michelle. Now we'll hear from Paul Jenner, who is a wildlife officer at Six Nations, and he'll be speaking about Indigenous perspectives and traditional knowledge in relation to protected areas. Paul?
Hello. Having a little trouble with the technology here as well so I'm on the phone. I have the computer on and I have my slideshow showing. Might have to have some assistance in moving from slide to slide there. If Coral can move these ahead for me, I'd appreciate it. So we'll give it a try here. So this is called Colonizing Our Environment, and preserving the wetlands and forestry on Six Nations plus, looking at other areas. Six Nations is one of the areas that does have still good wetlands and forest complex there. So it's we can use it as a bit of an example, I suppose. I'm going to try to flip this once and see what happens. Well, nothing's happening here, so could you guys flip to the next one for me? Good, thanks. So whenever we do these, and I'm not going to do the Thanksgiving address or anything like that, but I put this list up here just to show you that from a Six Nations standpoint, and again, preservation of spaces and all of that stuff, we always give thanks to our Creator for providing a lot of, well, not a lot of, everything that we need to be comfortable and thrive. So you can read the list there. To do this properly, it'll take 25 or 30 minutes to do the official opening and Thanksgiving address here. But I wanted to put it up there, and I always put it up there for an example to show that we actually we do take all of this preservation seriously. We have followed our teachings, and the result of that is flip to the next slide, please. Another example of some preserved land, which is Six Nations of the Grand River. And if you look in the Great Lakes Basin here, and this is hard to see on this screen, but all you have to do is when we're done here, go on the computer and Google the Great Lakes Basin and zoom down to just south of Hamilton. You'll be able to see the Six Nations Reserve there fairly clearly, and actually fairly quickly as you're zooming down. And the reason is because we have, as the text says there, you only need to look at the satellite photo of the Grand River Basin to understand the importance to holding on to a simple principle of respect for our environment and our ecological integrity. And it goes down farther to say, only 10% of Ontario wetlands are remaining. So it is, Southern Ontario suffered a great deal over many years, and in the name of progress and economical integrity and all this other stuff. So the Six Nations is located just south of Hamilton. You can see by the diagram there, and our original allotment of land, and that's another talk altogether as far as historic occupation of land goes. But you can see Six Nations is that kind of a pinkish square toward the bottom third of the gray area, and that's where Six Nations now resides. And it was originally a land base of 950,000 acres that was provided for us for our occupation and the loss of our occupation of the U.S. side of the border and our participation in you know, the many wars over there, and lots of our land over on that side. So this was kind of compensation for all that. And originally it was 1 million acres, and you can see the gray area that delineates that, and then the pink area which shows 6 nations, and then this area shows 6 nations itself. This is another satellite photo, but closer up. And again, if you Google Great Lakes Basin, you can see this actually, this photo on your own computer there, and you can enlarge it and then have a look. It's one of the last largest areas of Carolinian forest left in Canada, and you know, it's something that I'm always proud to brag on when I'm doing talks, but it's also very sad to think that it's kind of one of the last ones left. And so, you know, my involvement in all of this, and it's been for many, many years now, and decades in fact, was to try to you know, improve that situation, not only on 6 nations, but in our community and our neighboring counties, et cetera. As you can see, surrounding 6 nations is primarily farmland. So most of the land has been turned into farmland or urban areas. And unfortunately, you know, at one time, and I say all the time, that you could walk from Lake Erie to Lake Huron and never leave the bush, but that's not the case any longer. It's just the opposite. You can walk from Lake Erie now and get to Lake Huron and never see a large bush. So we've gone an actual reverse direction there as far as preservation goes. So, you know, we've been trying to, you know, hang on to what we have left here. As the next slide says, close to 1 million people will soon be occupying or living within the watershed itself. And it's, again, something that we are concerned with as 6 Nations being, you know, the recipient of 1 million people and on all the activities that are impacting the watershed. You know, and again, that's all goes. And you know, I'm always speaking to the converted when I'm talking about, you know, urbanization and farmland and destruction and deforestation and all of that stuff is impacting our environment. And again, the next slide is just going into, you know, some of the impacts that I've recorded myself over the years and talked about when I give these talks. Cumulative impacts in the name of progress, and you know, introduction of exotic species, industrial development, urban sprawl, creation of landfill, climate change, loss of habitat, creation of recreational areas. Kind of a strange ones to put up there. I'll explain. And insect infestation, you know, something that we didn't have to worry about too much, but we do now with climate change. Private property issues, agricultural practices, elimination of indigenous species. All of those things are a result of progress, and they have happened in the name of economic development of Southern Ontario. So they're all cumulative impacts, and you know, I don't know if there's one that's any worse than the other. You know, they all have an impact, and all of this stuff is now impacting the Great Lakes, and it probably has, you know, realistically for a long time. It's just that, you know, we're just starting to take notice of it now with these large algal blooms and Lake Erie and such. So you know, it's kind of a sobering thought to think that, you know, the human activity along the Great Lakes Basin can impact the fresh water of the Great Lakes area. It's something to be really concerned with. And that stretches over into the oceans as well. I mean, you know, we're getting all sorts of weather now from climate change and things. So we're making a lot of impacts, and they're not good ones. So can you switch to the next slide there, please? Thanks. And I've always said for many years, we belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to us. So, you know, it's always in the back of my mind whenever we're talking about, you know, First Nations views versus Western concepts of, you know, biodiversity and sustainability. There's a large difference between the two. You know, we believe we should be living within the land and what it's provided for us, as our Ganya Honyo says, and But you know, the Western concept was to tame the land, right? And that was you know, what the settlers did. They came in and they tamed it. They cut down all the trees and built cities and made agriculture a booming business and things. But you know, a little bit of acknowledgement of traditional knowledge might have helped that early on, but you know, we're getting there now, which is, you know, I'm not trying not to paint a bleak picture here, but you know, these things have happened, and that's why we're seeing issues with the Great Lakes. So next slide, please. Six Nations and other First Nations, you know, they have a different definition of harvest than what agricultural folks do. And you know, agricultural folks, and I understand all this. They're in it to try to make a living and survive and that sort of stuff. Six Nations is a little bit different in that we, you know, we try to be respectful when we do our harvesting, whether it's animals or natural plants. You know, we believe there's a certain season for taking certain plants and animals. We believe there's certain people that can take those. You know, not everybody is allowed to harvest a lot of times. We have people that are schooled in medicines and such that, you know how to go out and harvest plants, but they always do it in a respectful manner, and they always do it in a way that is ensuring that there's going to be some material left for next year for harvest. So you know, what I was told many years ago is that whenever you're harvesting plants, you only take every third one. That leaves 2/3 of the crop there to propagate and ensure that there's going to be a crop next year. So it's again a little bit different. We don't take it all. We try to make sure there's some left to naturally reproduce and then provide food for and medicines for the following year. Our culture is filled with ceremonies, the giving of thanks to these gifts, and again, it's referred to always in our opening statements whenever we're doing our meetings for the Ganyo, Hanyo, and we always give thanks for all that the Creator has provided for us. Next one, please. So we tried to, over the years, from a Six Nations standpoint, we tried to insert tech or traditional environmental knowledge, try and reverse some of the impacts of progress. So, these are just a list of some of the things that I've been involved in personally over many years. I've got a long list, but I don't like putting that up there. It looks like I'm bragging, but I'm not. Grand River Watershed Management Plan, Grand River Fisheries Management Plan, Red Hill Valley, Taquanya Nature Center, Lower Grand, Rouge River National Park. All these things we're involved with through Six Nations, and we're again always trying to insert a little bit of traditional knowledge into this to all of these projects to try to make sure they're not entirely wasteful of our environment, or they're going to impact our environment. We have lots of community groups that I talk to, and Six Nations is still a home of a lot of things. You guys are all familiar with the species at risk, et cetera, and I go to a lot of these meetings as well, and I quite often tell folks, not quite often, I always tell folks that the species at risk list is good and great, and we should be looking at that and providing information and recovery plans and everything else. But the species at risk list sometimes means almost nothing to First Nations people, because we believe all species are important to us, not just those species that are threatened or endangered. We have a lot of plants that you would class as weeds, and I've made that point many times over the years to various groups, that it's not just those species that are listed there that are important to us. It's all species that are important to us. And again, the proof is in the pudding. So, Six Nations still has, some species of snake here that you find that are hard to find otherwhere. Most of the turtle species, many bird species that you see nowhere else anymore, tree species, rodents, fish species. We have a really good collection species that are on that list, but we have a good collection of species that are not, that we're trying to protect. And I think that can be said for most First Nations, that they're all little islands of green space and all little islands of land that have managed to preserve their environment, and with that goes, as collateral success, all of these species that are now listed. First Nations lands are quite often the only areas where you see these any longer. So I've always used that as a bit of proof to say that we have the knowledge. We've always had the knowledge. The recognition has been hard to come, but it's coming. So, flip the next slide, please. So just a couple more in closing here. So again, speaking to the converted, we all know the value of natural systems for filtration, flood control, fisheries habitat, other habitat, climate change improvements and improvements to water quality. Next slide, please. Erosion control, runoff, wetland protection, habitat, carbon sequestration, all of that stuff, for most environmental people or ecological people, know the value very well of maintaining forests and maintaining habitat. It's just, again, something that we've always taught ourselves, and so that's why we still have the environment that we do. Next slide. I think that's the last slide, is the last one coming up here. Yeah. There's lots to do. I'm glad to see things are moving forward, and I'm glad to see issues like traditional environmental knowledge being taken more and more seriously. It's not where it should be, but it's getting there, which is I'm glad to see. There's lots to do for sure, and that one's kind of hard to read. Sorry about that. But the times are coming, and the knowledge has always been there. So let's make use of it and see what we can do as far as moving some of these targets up to the protected areas, and looking toward targets like 20% improvement and things. Those are all good targets, and can take a long time to do, but I think working together with First Nations, I think is a very good and positive step in all of this. So that's the end of my slideshow there. I think there was one more, I believe. Yeah, one more. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much for sharing, Paul.
Okay,
Yermo Yorlava, our protected areas consultant, will speak now about the progress we've made on the development of our protected areas strategy thus far, and introduce our proposed conservation targets for the region. Yermo?
Thanks, Coral, and thanks, Paul and Michelle, for your great introduction to this discussion we're having today. Just what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit more background on Carolinian Canada's big picture, a little bit of insight or a look at Pathway to Canada Target 1, which relates to the Aichi target, the international target of aiming to protect 17% of the landscape around the world by 2020. Building on Paul's discussion, opportunities that we have here through this protected area strategy to work towards reconciliation and partnership with our Indigenous communities and partners on the landscape, and the challenges and opportunities that we face protecting and conserving nature on a working landscape that is 95% privately owned. And lastly, how you as webinar participants can be involved. So one way you can be involved is just to think about, we have a couple of poll questions. Maybe Coral might want to jump in as to how you actually respond to these, but basically while we're going through this, maybe you can be thinking about what you see as the major barriers to expanding the network of protected areas are on the landscape. So we've put down 5 options just because of the technology only allowed us to do that. So if there are other barriers that we haven't listed there, please put them, insert them as text into the chat box and we'll record those. So Coral, if you want to just quickly give instructions.
Great, so the poll is live, so you should be able to just choose your options and then click submit, and we'll be able to see the results.
Thank you. So first off, I would like to thank, we would all like to thank the task force that has been involved in working through this strategy so far. We've been meeting by phone, conference calls since the beginning of the summer. And there's been some really fantastic discussion. I won't name everyone offhand on the list, but we have Indigenous communities, academia, various levels of government, and NGOs all represented, and land trusts as well. And just a bit on the big picture vision, which Carolinian Canada has been promoting since the early 2000s for a healthy landscape with healthy ecosystems, core natural areas that are protected or conserved, and connecting corridors, all contributing to healthy people and healthy economies on the landscape. In that context, we actually know that we're still losing areas that are supposedly protected through provincial policy, such as provincially significant wetlands. We know of some of these. This is an example you're seeing that was a bulldozed forest a few years ago, swamp forest that was provincially significant wetland is now agricultural land. At the same time, we've had some great conservation successes as well. One example might be the establishment of the New Rouge National Urban Park. Also some really incredible private acquisitions, securements of land by some of the land trusts and the Nature Conservancy of Canada in the zone that are very encouraging. So what is the strategy meant to do? First thing is we just need to better assess the current context of landscape protection and conservation in the landscape. We are collaborating to set realistic goals and develop high impact strategies to meet those goals. We're attempting collaboratively to set priorities and identify the best opportunities on the landscape to expand the protected areas network. And part of the process, so we're aiming to complete those A, B, and C at the sort of high level this fiscal year, so by the end of March. And a part of that will be developing a 5-year implementation plan that we hope to take forward with our collaborating partners and hopefully with a bit of funding from somewhere as well. So the key principles that we're operating with are reconciliation. So we want the strategy to respect and align with Indigenous worldviews, as Paul has been describing, and treaty rights that exist on this landscape. That it's collaboratively developed with Indigenous partners, and that it's celebrated by the Southern Ontario communities it serves. So Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we want to learn from each other in a respectful, ethical space and find good solutions together, recognizing that natural law, which you could also equate to ecological law or the Creator's law, underlies everything we're trying to do here. Another key principle is biodiversity. So ensure that the expanded network of protected and conserved areas provides key ecological benefits, including high biodiversity conservation, species at risk, ecological representation, irreplaceability, large natural areas get protected, habitat connectivity is improved, and that the network includes climate change refugia. And the reason I included that map in the presentation is that a lot of that work has already been done through Ontario Nature's Greenways program, the Carolinian Canada Big Picture, the Carolinian Canada Conservation Action Plans, Natural Heritage Systems Plans by conservation authorities, watershed strategies, etc. So there's a lot of good information and good thinking out there to work Another key principle is resilient communities. So ensuring that the strategy leads to the protection of a natural system that sustains the health and well-being of both wild communities and human communities, as well as contributes in a positive way to local economies in the face of climate change. And we all know the benefits that natural infrastructure brings to our human communities. All sorts of great services that nature provides that we can't do without. Another key principle is that we want the strategy is that we want to develop effective tools, so innovative tools to assist in land protection and conservation through securement, easements, improved stewardship, conservation investment, improved partnerships and collaboration, better programs, policies, and incentives, better education and outreach, and other relevant methods as determined through collaboration with the task force and with the broader conservation community and beyond the conservation community. So we want your input. Another key principle, landowner stewardship. So in some parts of Canada, there's a lot of public land, a lot of Indigenous land where it's in a relatively natural state. And the impacts aren't as great. But on this landscape, with such complexity of ownership, 95% of it being fee simple private land, good stewardship is going to be a critical foundation to growing a culture of protection. Another key principle, connected community. So we need to recognize that people need to connect to the land. Partners need to connect to each other to ensure healthy ecosystems and protected areas. That's the only way it's going to work. As such, we also need to ensure that places of spiritual and cultural importance can and should be included in the network. So the approach we're taking right now is to collaborate. As mentioned, we have this multi-sector, multi-group protected areas task force, which is meeting once a month, but actually much more frequently. We have weekly communications around specific items, one-on-one interviews and discussions with, we're doing that ourselves through phone calls and other, meetings, etc. Help develop the strategy with a diverse range of partners. This webinar. We have 2 stakeholder workshops coming up, and the tentative dates, I believe the one date is pretty much confirmed, so October 26th, with Paul General and Six Nations help and support, will be held at Six Nations of the Grand River. And that's October 26th. And then the other one we're expecting will be hosted and held at the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation towards the end of November. Tentative date is November 27th. We're also planning a major forum for the winter, so end of January or early February. And also we have a network survey. So in addition to these poll questions that you've received during the webinar right now, there's a longer, more robust survey that we're really hoping you and your colleagues, anyone interested across the zone will fill out, so we can that will contribute to the strategy, both with good ideas and we get a better sense from our perspective as to what you feel the priorities are. So the approach. One thing that we really want to do is explore the feasibility of innovative approaches. So co-management of sites with Indigenous communities. We've been talking a lot about this notion of accreditation or certification of conservation lands to recognize good practices, to ensure standards, and to actually be able to track the extent and quality of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures that are occurring on the landscape. We don't really track that all that well at this point. We're thinking that enhanced conservation easement tools, better support for easements might be a way to facilitate protection of lands on this very, very high cost landscape in terms of dollar value. And social impact financing. Are there ways that we can bring new investment and coalesce investment in a better way for land securement? Number 3, we want to ensure that what we're doing aligns with the global, national, and provincial guidelines and definitions for protected areas. So there is a global standard for that, and that's by IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So we want to be able to show where the protected and conserved network on the Carolinian landscape fits within that context. And here's a rather wordy slide that I don't expect anyone to read. But basically what we've done in our tallying so far, or what agencies have done, is counted only the first 3 categories roughly, maybe with some exceptions, in Southern Ontario anyway, as contributing to the protected area network. So that would be provincial parks, national parks, perhaps conservation authority areas, provincial nature reserves. Those sorts of things are getting counted. But we are looking to expand the opportunities for actually accounting towards the 17% or whatever goal we're aiming for. We're looking at, one of those is Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So we want to align with the Indigenous Circle of Experts, a national initiative, and their Rise Together publication that's available online. And what Indigenous protected and conserved areas are will be described in a little more detail in this presentation. There are opportunities for tribal parks, and then perhaps other effective area-based conservation measures on this landscape. Another aspect of the approach is to provide guidance to protect a greater percentage of the land base by collaboratively identifying potential protected areas, progressive protected area goals, barriers to meeting protected areas criteria. So that's where your first goal question comes in. Securement priorities, where will we achieve the best bang for the protection dollar, if you could say. And what are the information gaps and digital data gaps that will help, that we need to address in order to make better decisions. Another aspect of the approach is that we're going to be nesting or putting a lot of the information we gather into the context or into the software and the structure of open standards, which is an internationally recognized and used all around the world approach to doing conservation planning. I won't get into all the details of that, but we'll have a standardized ways to share information, store information, track information, and adaptively manage the process. The proposed conservation targets, so there's been a lot of discussion within the task force and beyond around what the actual targets should be. So what are the entities that we want to actually expand on the landscape to create this enhanced, expanded natural protected areas network? At the moment, we're working with 5. It could be reduced possibly to 4. But ones we've agreed on tentatively so far are protected areas on public lands, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or IPCAs, protected areas on private land, other stewardship sites. So these would be candidate protected areas and other restoration sites, which we might want to combine with the stewardship sites. So just in a little more detail for explanation and some examples. So protected areas on public lands include all public land sites that meet the IUCN protected area criteria, so the strict international criteria. These include national parks, provincial parks, conservation authority areas in some cases, national wildlife areas, where the primary objective is biodiversity protection in perpetuity. In many cases, these IUCN criteria are only met within certain management zones of such sites, so recreational or infrastructure, type zoning be included. Indigenous protected and conserved areas are lands and waters where Indigenous governments have the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. IPCAs vary in terms of their governance and management objectives across Canada, but they generally share 3 essential elements. They're Indigenous-led, they represent a long-term commitment to conservation, they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities. So we're exploring opportunities to create a network of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. as part of this strategy, a key focus. Constitutional treaty rights extend across large expanses of this landscape, so overlap is likely between these IPCAs and the other conservation targets. With appropriate recognition, some of these may meet the IUCN protected area criteria in the future if we can be creative and work together. Some examples that would be protected and conserved lands on First Nation reserves, areas beyond reserves where treaty rights are exercised for traditional use or other conservation purposes, co-managed protected areas. There's also already some co-management happening at sites like Rondo and Point Pelee and other areas. Tribal parks, which we have some, like there are examples outside of the zone. I'm not sure if there are within the zone. And then Indigenous land trust properties. For example, we have at least one Walpole Island Land Trust is an Indigenous run land trust. Protected areas on private land would be all those sites that are on private land that actually meet IUCN protected area criteria. And that they must include the conservation of nature and biodiversity in perpetuity. So we, Nature Conservancy of Canada and land trust sites, any of those properties already have that goal in them and need to be counted. But many of us are, that's the general movement. Protected areas on private land. Examples include, as mentioned, Nature Conservancy of Canada, Ontario Nature Reserves, and then land trust properties. And then the other two conservation targets, other stewardship sites and other restoration sites. These could be called candidate protected areas. So they are sites on private or public land that are being managed, stored, or stewarded for nature conservation. They may actually have management plans, easements, or conservation agreements in place. The sites don't meet the IUCN protected area criteria, usually because there isn't a legal mechanism or commitment to protect them in perpetuity. With appropriate changes to regulation and permitted activities, these sites could meet those protected area criteria in the future. And developing effective stepping stone tools to build a culture of protection to voluntarily raise the level of protection of such sites will be a primary focus of this strategy. So ALICE projects, Ducks Unlimited projects, Carolinian Canada Landowner Leader Sites, Conservation Authority restoration projects on private land could meet those criteria in the future. Restored pits and quarries also, safe harbor agreement sites, which don't have that perpetuity aspect to them, but potentially could be included in the suite. Zoning protection, municipal drains might provide an opportunity for landscape connectivity, utility corridors, decommissioned rail lines, etc. Many of these are already initiatives working to protect these and conserve nature on them. So almost last slide here. So we also had lots of discussion as to what the actual goals should be and how the conservation targets fit into those protection goals. So there's general agreement on the task force that with only 2.5% protected, we're not going to meet the IT target of 17% formally protected by 2020. That's 17% actually exceeds the amount of habitat that we have, and on a landscape that's 95% private land, it doesn't seem realistic. So what's being proposed at the moment is this notion of moving forward. So ideally doubling the amount of formally protected that meets the IUCN criteria in 10 years. So that's the SAVE biodiversity line there. And that would include those first three conservation targets. So combined, if we could get those up, double those from 2.5% to 5% in 10 years, and then work towards 17% perhaps in 50 years. A really important part of this is engaging broader community that's doing conservation out there. So all the people doing good stewardship, and there are many, many that aren't getting counted in the picture right now. So that would be, and really increasing that through various programs to over 50 years, having 50% of the landscape covered in some kind of healthy habitat agreement, whether it's urban properties that are planting native plants to rural efforts, farms being, farmed sustainably with biodiversity in mind, et cetera, et cetera. And the third approach that that is part of this strategy is we need, with only 15% natural cover, even just to get to the 17% protected, we need to increase the amount of natural cover. And we really, for healthy landscapes, we want 30% or even 50%. So that's another aspect of this, is those restoration areas. So that's what that table means. Michelle, did you want to add anything to what I just said about the proposed goals? And then we're pretty much done here, almost on time.
Yeah, no, I think you've explained it well. I just reiterate that the Big Picture Collaborative is focusing on the first step of reversing the trend of habitat loss. So we're still losing habitat, and I think reversing that trend of habitat loss is a clear first stepping stone for a good protected area strategy as well.
Thanks, Michelle. And just advance here. So the second poll question, which I think we'll post for you here. So what changes are needed from your perspective to expand the network of protected and conserved areas in Southern Ontario? So again, we're limited to just 5 options. So if you have other ideas, and I'm sure you will, please submit them to us through the chat box. Here are your options for changes. So please select what you think is the most important. And then please offer us more comments. And Coral, if we can return to the presentation.
Yep, we'll just give everyone a couple more seconds.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I will advance. Oh, there's already a thank you in here. So that means we're at the end of my section, but I thought there was still, oh yes. So I guess, Coral, if you want to go through this slide, you're most welcome to, but thank you.
Sure, thanks, Yermo. So you've given us a lot to think about and digest, so we'll give everyone some time to submit your questions. And while we're waiting, if you'd like to participate further, please visit our website. You can also participate by joining our workshops this fall. We also encourage you to sign on to Ontario Nature's Declaration, which now has 110 groups that have signed on to endorse protected places in Ontario, which is fantastic. And as Yermo mentioned, we're hoping that many of you will fill out our network survey, which will be online shortly. So lots of ways to engage there. Please keep an eye out on our Protected Areas webpage for more information about the workshops and the survey. And we'll be sending around links to all participants by email, along with the webinar recording sometime next week. So thanks a lot, Yermo. And while we wait for the questions, I can share the results from the poll. So our first question here about the major barriers to expanding and enhancing the network of protected areas. We have our results on the screen. And the large majority said competing economic interests and tax incentives for development. Go to the results of the second poll. What changes are needed to expand the network of protected and conserved areas? With the majority saying stronger role for private landowners in stewardship programs.
Just to note, I think in the first poll, people could pick 3, and in this poll, they could pick 1. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we do have one question that came in. So Michelle, on one of your last slides, where you colored in the green, the question is, in Michelle's slide on the goals to green, I noticed that the Niagara region was not colored in as green. And this person was wondering if that was purposeful or just a general indication of greening in the zone.
So our area of consideration is the entire Carolinian Zone, and that was an oversight. So thanks for catching that. There is There are some areas where we have more green, like Norfolk and Niagara, and there are areas where we are actually increasing habitat. But in general, the overall zone is needs more habitat. So we are looking to enable scale up and track efforts across the zone in every municipality.
Okay, great. And someone else has asked, how is healthy habitat defined?
I can start, and then maybe Jarmo might want to come in. So if you use our in the zone tracker, it gives you a measure of healthy habitat. And it's a relative measure, and it's based on a number of factors, but the main overriding factor is the percentage of native plants. So if you're familiar with some butterfly gardens that don't have any native plants, they're more like junk food for butterflies. They can get sugar water out of it, but they can't support the life cycle or the babies of that species. So native plants are really essential and have co-evolved with wildlife over thousands of years to support healthy wildlife populations, as well as provide functional ecosystem services. In some cases, native plants can be used as non-native plants can be used as a substitute, for instance, in erosion control, but then you're missing the bonus that you get from using native plants that gives you that extra ability to protect biodiversity. So every time you're planting a non-native plant, you're taking up space, valuable space that's at a premium in the Carolinian Zone, where we could actually be growing biodiversity. And it can be as simple as growing one native wildflower. And so protected areas, the health of them, there's a lot of different ways to measure that. But one of the simple ways for you in your backyard or in your neighborhood is to look at the percentage of native plants. Jarmo, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. No, that's really well put, Michelle. So we're in the Carolinian Zone. The situation is somewhat different from because of the extreme levels of land conversion and habitat loss. In a sense, we have to set the bar pretty low because any improvement, such as what Michelle is describing, planting native plants, you're actually giving the native biodiversity a chance. So the idea here would be that the areas that fit the IUCN criteria right off the bat are generally going to be those areas that have the sort of full range of biodiversity, et cetera, because they're well protected. And but those areas need supporting landscape or surrounding landscape that's contributing to their health. And native plants are really the foundation for that. So if you're planting non-native species, you're actually taking away habitat. You're adding something. You're adding some green. But if you're actually planting what normally have occurred in that area, and perhaps taking into account change in climate and that. So that things are always changing, and there are some non-Indigenous species that are never going to go away. All that said, you can be part of the solution if you're planting native species, and even our urban gardens in the Carolinian Zone can make a positive contribution just by keeping the genetic diversity out there, providing homes for insects and other wildlife, and adding connectivity to the landscape, etc. Just a great example is a recent study of migratory birds and what trees they actually spend time in urban areas, and the Norway maples and the ginkgos and the European plane trees or whatever that have traditionally been planted as ornamental trees. Birds might visit them, but they only visit them for a few seconds. They move on. They stay they go to the oaks and the maples and the birches and the poplars that are native to the area, and that's where their insect supply is. So, and those birds need those trees to stock up their fat reserves to fly further north to their breeding grounds or whatever. So it's, there's all kinds of good studies out there showing that the native plants are essential.
Thanks, Yerma. We have a few other questions coming in. So this one I'll defer to you. What policy mechanisms are available to move candidate protected areas to legal protection on public and Crown lands?
I wish Ann Bell was on the call right now, because Ontario Nature has been working on that a great deal, and we're certainly looking at those. I think I'm going to not answer that question because the answer isn't at the tip of my tongue, but also I think we have government agency people, since we're talking about public lands, who would probably better talk about the specifics of that, unless Michelle, you want to jump in.
So I actually, Tanya Pulfer from Ontario Nature is online. Tanya, can I unmute you?
Yeah, and I would just say that that is exactly what the strategy is going to look at. That's what we're going to be talking about over the next year.
Hi,
sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, Yarmo. Hi, Carl. Hi, everybody. So Anne is really the best person to be talking about this, but basically there are a number of mechanisms that are potential to be used to protect this and put it into permanency. But really the OECM standards that have been set up by the IUCN, so that's the other effective conservation measures, suggest a number of ways that things could become permanent and get that permanency. Did I answer the question, but like in general? But I think that it's so vast, it's really hard to narrow down, and you need to have a specific example to really talk about that, right?
Yes, exactly. So I could give one example that we have talked about on the task force, and that is that the province is looking at changing the status of some of the leased Crown lands or areas that are currently being farmed that are actually Crown land in the zone to provincial park status, which would then don't quote me on that entirely, but that is what we've heard. So that would be an example of that sort of thing happening, and those opportunities do exist out there.
And I think the big thing, though, is to recognize that we want to hold a certain standard. Like, we don't want it to be everything. We want it to meet that sort of, high biodiversity or even protection and permanency. So things like off-road vehicle use, we'd have to really look at that. Managed forests, we'd really have to look at that to fit the IUCN categories. We would want ideally to be 1 to 3, but 4 acceptable sometimes as well, in the IUCN category slide that Yarmo had put up before.
Great, thank you. Next question, if the largest barrier for private land incentives is a guarantee of conservation in perpetuity, what is being done to create a policy that advances this?
So again, that is just the type of thing that strategy will be aiming to find and to recommend through our collaborative effort. So we don't have an answer to that right now, unless someone else wants to jump in, but that's exactly the type of thing that we're aiming to have some clearer, at least recommendations around for the strategy.
Yeah, and I'll add to that the strategy is a way to address those questions. So if that's at top of your mind and you want to get involved in coming out with recommendations for that, this is the opportunity, and it's a small window of opportunity.
Great, and I'll finish off with the last question, and if anyone has questions at another time, please feel free to contact any one of us, and we'll follow up with you that way. So a general question about what happens after the strategy is complete. So at what point do the partners and collaboratives start to become responsible for parts of this plan from a very tactical and specific goal perspective, not just high-level support and engagement?
Again, have to be a little political with the answer to this, or at least that is what we are aiming to do with the 5-year implementation plan. So we're still in the early phases. We've still been working out things like the conservation targets and the goals and that sort of thing. Over the next several months is when we will be bringing some clear language about that very specific question. So, 5-year implementation plan as well as, longer term goals.
Great. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. We had really great participation. That's awesome. We hope that you'll continue to participate in us in the ways that we've outlined, and we'll reach out to you next week with a link to all of our resources and a recording of this webinar.
Thanks, Coral, and everyone.
Thanks, everyone.